The Millionaire's Gambit. A millionaire forced his daughter to marry a homeless man to humiliate her, but everyone was terrified by what the homeless man said at the wedding. Emma Thompson walked along the cobblestone streets of the city, her heart beating to the rhythm of the compassion she felt for every needy soul she encountered. At 25, she was the epitome of beauty and kindness, with her hazel eyes shining with empathy and her wavy brown hair framing a face that always had a smile for everyone. The daughter of a prominent family, Emma had grown up surrounded by luxury and privilege, but her heart had never hardened to the difficulties of others. From a young age, her biological mother, Sarah, had instilled values of generosity and empathy in her, teaching her that true wealth lay in helping others. However, Emma's life took a drastic turn when, at the age of 10, she lost her mother in a tragic accident. Her father, devastated by the loss, sank into a deep depression that led him to emotionally distance himself from his daughter. It was then that Robert Taylor entered their lives. Robert, a millionaire widower businessman, presented himself as a savior for the Thompson family. With his charisma and apparent kindness, he quickly gained the trust of Emma's father and, in less than a year, became her stepfather. From the beginning, Robert showed a special interest in Emma, but not for the reasons everyone thought. As Emma grew older, her kindness and desire to help others intensified. Every time she went out on the street, she couldn't help but stop to help someone in need, whether it was buying food for the homeless or simply offering a word of encouragement to those who needed it. This attitude, which many found admirable, became a source of frustration for Robert. He saw Emma's behavior as a threat to the family's social status, and more importantly, to his own hidden interests. On a sunny spring afternoon, Emma was in the city's Central Park, handing out sandwiches and coffee to a group of homeless people. Among them, one man in particular caught her attention. He was about 30 years old, but his haggard face and lost gaze made him look much older. Despite his unkempt appearance, there was something in his blue eyes that conveyed deep sadness and at the same time a spark of dignity. "Hello," Emma greeted with a warm smile, offering him a sandwich and a cup of coffee. "My name is Emma. What's yours?" The man looked at her with a mixture of surprise and distrust, as if he wasn't used to someone speaking to him so kindly. "Jack," he replied after a moment of hesitation. "My name is Jack." Emma sat down, next to him on the park bench, ignoring the disapproving looks from some passers-by. "Nice to meet you, Jack. Do you mind if I keep you company for a while?" Jack shook his head, still bewildered by Emma's attitude. Gradually, as they shared that moment, Jack began to open up. He told Emma fragments of his life, how he had lost his job, his home, and finally his family. He spoke of the years he had spent on the street, of cold nights and days of hunger. Emma listened attentively, her heart moved by every word. Without thinking twice, she took a card from her purse and handed it to Jack. "This is the number of a shelter where I volunteer," she explained. "If you ever need a safe place to sleep or a hot meal, don't hesitate to go. Ask for me, I'll be happy to help you." Jack took the card with trembling hands, his eyes moistening for the first time in years. "Thank you," he murmured. "It's been a long time since anyone cared about me." Emma gently squeezed his hand, conveying in that gesture all the compassion she felt. Everyone deserves a second chance. Jack, never lose hope. What Emma didn't know was that this casual encounter in the park would be the catalyst for a series of events that would change her life forever. As she returned home, feeling satisfied for having helped someone else, she couldn't imagine that her stepfather Robert was watching her from afar, his face contorted in a grimace of disgust and his eyes gleaming with a malevolent idea. Robert. Taylor waited in his luxurious office, his fingers impatiently drumming on the mahogany desk. The evening light filtered through the large windows, casting elongated shadows on the walls covered with diplomas and awards. The sound of heels echoed in the hallway, and seconds later, Emma entered the room. "You called for me, Robert?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of respect and wariness. Robert stood up slowly, his imposing figure standing out against the backdrop of the city stretching behind him. "Yes, Emma, we need to talk about your recent behavior." Emma frowned, confused. My behavior? I don't understand what you mean. Robert let out a dry laugh, devoid of humor. Of course you don't understand. That's precisely the problem. He approached her, his cold eyes fixed on Emma's. I saw you today in the park, fraternizing with those beggars. The contempt in his voice made Emma shudder. I was just helping, Robert. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong? Robert raised his voice, making Emma instinctively step back. Do you realize what you're doing? You're tarnishing the family name, dragging through the mud everything your father and I have built. Emma felt anger beginning to boil inside her. Tarnish the family name by helping those in need. That's exactly what my mother taught me to do. The mention of Emma's mother seemed to enrage Robert even more. Your mother is dead, Emma, and it's time you understand how the real world works. He moved away from her, walking towards the window. For a moment he seemed to be lost in his thoughts, and when he spoke again, his voice had a calculating tone that made Emma's blood run cold. I think it's time you learn a lesson about the consequences of your actions. Emma looked at him, a feeling of dread growing in her chest. What do you mean? Robert turned to her, a cold smile curving his lips. You're going to get married, Emma. The shock made Emma take a few seconds to process the words. Married. But to whom? Robert's smile widened, acquiring a cruel tint. To that homeless man you so kindly helped today. I believe his name was Jack. The color drained from Emma's face. You can't be serious. This is madness, Robert. You can't force me to marry someone I barely know. Oh, but I can, Robert replied, his voice loaded with a threatening calm. As your legal guardian, I have the authority to arrange your marriage. And if you refuse, well, let's just say that shelter you're so fond of might suddenly find itself without funds. Emma felt the world crumbling around her. She knew Robert was capable of carrying out his threats, and the idea of innocent people suffering because of her was unbearable. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Robert approached again, this time with an expression that mixed triumph and false compassion. Because it's time you learn that kindness has a price, Emma, and you're going to pay it. As Emma left the office with silent tears running down her cheeks, she couldn't imagine that this cruel twist of fate would be just the beginning of a story that would change her life and that of everyone around her in ways no one could foresee. The days following Robert's announcement were a whirlwind of emotions for Emma. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, unable to believe that her life had taken such a drastic turn in so little time. Robert, for his part, was relentless in his decision. He had located Jack, and using his influence and a combination of threats and false promises, had convinced him to accept the marriage. Emma tried to talk to her father, but years of depression and alcohol dependence had turned him into a shadow of his former self. When she told him about Robert's plans, her father simply nodded with a vacant stare and mumbled, "Robert knows what's best for you, sweetie." The night before the wedding, Emma was in her room, sitting in front of her dressing table mirror. Her reflection showed a young woman whose light seemed to have gone out as she mechanically brushed her long brown hair. The memory of her mother became so vivid, she could almost feel her presence. "My little Emma," her mother used to say, "always remember that true love comes in the most unexpected ways. Trust your heart, because it will never deceive you." A solitary tear rolled down Emma's cheek. How could she trust her heart when she felt it was breaking into 1,000 pieces? The wedding day dawned cloudy, as if the sky itself wanted to reflect Emma's mood. The ceremony would take place in the mansion's private chapel, a place that had once been a source of peace for Emma, but today felt like a prison. As she prepared, helped by her faithful housekeeper, Mrs. Jenkins, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Jack. How would he feel about all this? Had Robert threatened him too? "My child," said Mrs. Jenkins, adjusting the veil over Emma's hair. "I know this isn't what you dreamed of, but remember that sometimes, from the darkest situations, the brightest light emerges." Emma tried to smile, grateful for the affection of the woman who had been like a second mother to her since Sarah's death. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. I just hope I have the strength to face what's coming." The music began to play, signaling that it was time for Emma to make her entrance. With trembling steps, She walked down the aisle of the chapel. The few guests, all friends and associates of Robert, looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and poorly disguised pity. Upon reaching the altar, Emma saw Jack dressed as a groom for the first time. Despite the elegant clothes Robert had provided him, there was something in his posture that betrayed his discomfort. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Emma could see in them the same fear and confusion she felt. The ceremony proceeded like a hazy dream. Emma heard the priest's words as if they were coming from far away, and when the time came to say, "I do," her voice sounded weak and trembling. Just as the priest was about to declare them husband and wife, the chapel doors burst open. All present turned, surprised, to see an older man enter, of distinguished appearance and penetrating gaze. "Stop this farce!" shouted the newcomer, his voice echoing off the chapel walls. Robert, who until that moment had been observing the ceremony with a smile of satisfaction, turned pale at the sight of the man. "What is the meaning of this, Alexander?" Robert asked, trying to maintain his composure. "How dare you interrupt?" "Silence, Robert," Alexander cut him off. "I've come to prevent you from making the worst mistake of your life." Then, addressing Emma and Jack, he added, "and to reveal a truth that will change the course of your lives." A murmur of expectation ran through the chapel. Emma, still confused, looked at Jack, who seemed as bewildered as she was. Alexander advanced towards the altar, his eyes fixed on Jack. "Boy, do you really not recognize me?" Jack frowned, studying the older man's face. Suddenly a flash of recognition shone in his eyes. You were in my dreams, in my confused childhood memories." Alexander nodded, a sad smile curving his lips. "I'm Alexander Morgan, your parents' best friend, Jack, and I've spent the last few years desperately searching for you." The silence that followed this declaration was deafening. Jack took a step back, visibly shocked. "My parents? But I don't remember." "I know, son," Alexander said softly. "You suffered a terrible trauma when you were a child. Your parents, Andrew and Mary Carter, owned one of the largest fortunes in the country, but they died in an accident when you were barely 8 years old." Emma, processing all this information, instinctively took Jack's hand, offering silent support. Alexander continued, "After the accident, you disappeared. There were those who said you had died too, but I never believed it. I've spent years following every lead, every rumor, until I finally found you." Robert, who had been listening with a mixture of disbelief and growing panic, tried to intervene. "This is ridiculous. You can't believe the words of this man. He's clearly—" "Shut up, Robert," Alexander spat, his voice loaded with contempt. "Your game is over." Then, addressing Jack and Emma again, he added, "Jack, you are the legitimate heir to the Carter fortune. A fortune that, I must add, rivals that of the Thompsons." The murmurs in the chapel intensified. Emma looked at Jack, seeing how the confusion on his face slowly gave way to a mixture of amazement and recognition. I remember fragments," Jack murmured. "A big house, gardens, the face of a woman, smiling." "Your mother," Alexander confirmed with a nostalgic smile. "Mary had the warmest smile I've ever known." Suddenly, as if a floodgate had opened in his mind, memories began to overwhelm Jack. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the images and emotions that assailed him. Emma knelt beside him, holding him as silent tears ran down both their cheeks. At that moment, something changed between them. They were no longer two strangers, forced into a marriage, but two souls united by pain and disbelief at the twists of fate. Robert, seeing how his plan was crumbling before his eyes, tried to sneak out quietly. But Alexander, anticipating his movements, made a signal, and 2 police officers, who had discreetly entered, blocked the exit. "Not so fast, Robert," Alexander said. "You'll have to answer for your actions, not only for this marriage farce, but for your role in concealing Jack's true identity all these years." As Robert was detained, cursing and threatening everyone present, Emma helped Jack to his feet. Their gazes met, and for the first time since they met, they really saw each other. "I'm so sorry," Emma whispered. "I had no idea." Jack shook his head, a small smile forming on his lips. "You have nothing to apologize for. In fact, I think I should thank you." "Thank me?" Emma asked, confused. "Yes," Jack replied, his voice loaded with emotion. "If you hadn't been so kind to me that day in the park, if you hadn't shown compassion to a stranger, none of this would have happened. Your kindness, Emma, has given me back my identity, my past, my future." Emma felt her heart racing at Jack's words. For the first time in weeks, a feeling of hope began to bloom in her chest. Alexander approached the couple, an expression of satisfaction on his face. "There's much we need to discuss, many legal details to attend to. But for now, I think you both need time to process all of this." Jack nodded, grateful. Then, looking around at the chapel decorated for a wedding that didn't come to completion, he let out a soft laugh. "I guess the marriage is cancelled, right?" Emma laughed too, feeling the tension of the past few weeks dissipate. "I think that would be best." Although, she added, looking at Jack with a mixture of shyness and hope, "Maybe we could start over this time, really getting to know each other." Jack took Emma's hand in his, a spark of something new shining in his eyes. "I'd love that." As the guests began to disperse, excitedly commenting on the unexpected events, Emma and Jack left the chapel together. The sun had managed to break through the clouds, bathing the mansion's garden in a golden light that seemed to herald a new beginning. Alexander watched them from the chapel entrance, a smile of satisfaction on his face. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be many questions to answer, many obstacles to overcome. But seeing Emma and Jack walking together, talking in low voices and sharing shy smiles, he felt that finally things were taking the right course. What none of them knew at that moment was that this unexpected twist of fate was just the beginning. The revelations of that day would trigger a series of events that would test not only the nascent bond between Emma and Jack, but also their own values and convictions. The path to truth and redemption was just beginning, and with it a love story that would defy all expectations. The days following the failed wedding were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations for Emma and Jack. Alexander Morgan, true to his word, took charge of initiating the legal processes to reinstate Jack as the legitimate heir to the Carter fortune. Meanwhile, the Thompson mansion became the scene of intense police investigations, with Robert Taylor as the main suspect in an intricate network of fraud and manipulation. Emma, still processing recent events, found comfort in long conversations with Jack as he recovered more and more fragments of his past. He shared with her stories of his childhood, of the parents he barely remembered, and of the privileged life he once had. One afternoon, as they strolled through the mansion's gardens, Jack stopped in front of an old oak tree. His gaze was lost in the distance, as if he were seeing something beyond the present. "You know, Emma," he began, his voice tinged with nostalgia, "I have a blurry memory of a tree like this in my parents' house. I used to climb its branches, imagining I was an explorer in distant lands." Emma smiled, gently taking Jack's hand. "It must be difficult, recovering, all those memories at once." Jack nodded, lightly squeezing Emma's hand. "Sometimes I feel like I'm watching someone else's life. It's overwhelming." "I'm here for you," Emma responded sincerely. "I know we barely know each other, but I want you to know you can count on me." Jack looked at her, a grateful smile lighting up his face. "Thank you, Emma. I don't know what I'd do without you right now." As they walked back to the house, Emma couldn't help but think about how strange fate was. Just a few weeks ago, the idea of marrying Jack seemed like a nightmare. Now she found in him a friend, a confidant, and maybe something more. However, the relative peace they had found was about to be shaken. That same night, as they dined in the main dining room, Mrs. Jenkins entered hurriedly, her face pale and worried. "Miss Emma, Mr. Jack," she said, her voice trembling, "you have to see this." She turned on the dining room television, quickly tuning to the local news. The image of Robert Taylor, handcuffed and being escorted by police, filled the screen. In an unexpected turn of events, the anchor announced, "Businessman Robert Taylor has been arrested on charges of fraud, manipulation, and possible complicity in the disappearance of the Carter family heir more than 2 decades ago. Sources close to The investigation suggests that Taylor may have been involved in an elaborate scheme to conceal Jack Carter's true identity and thus maintain control over several family fortunes. Emma and Jack looked at each other, stunned. The news continued, revealing increasingly sordid details about Robert's activities over the years. "I can't believe it," Emma murmured, feeling her world shake once again. "I knew Robert wasn't a good person, but this..." Jack, for his part, had fallen silent, his gaze fixed on the screen. When he finally spoke, his voice was loaded with a mixture of pain and contained anger. All this time, how many lives did he ruin? How many families did he destroy for his ambition? Emma moved closer to him, putting a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of support. "The important thing is that now the truth is coming to light. Justice will be done, Jack." But justice, as they would soon discover, was a long and complicated road. In the following days, the Thompson mansion was besieged by journalists and curious onlookers, all eager to obtain more details about the scandal that was shaking high society. Alexander Morgan became a constant presence, working tirelessly to protect Jack's interests and help him navigate the complicated legal process ahead. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in the study, Alexander paused, looking at Jack with a mixture of affection and concern. "There's something else I must tell you, Jack," he began, his voice grave. "Something I've been investigating since I found you." Jack looked up from the papers, intrigued. "What is it, Alexander?" The older man sighed deeply before continuing, "I believe your parents' death, it may not have been an accident." The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Emma, who had been helping organize some files, dropped the folder she was holding, scattering papers across the floor. "What do you mean?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. Alexander stood up, walking to the window. His figure was silhouetted against the evening light as he spoke. "I've found some inconsistencies in the reports from that time. Details that don't add up, testimonies that seem to have been altered." Jack stood up abruptly, his chair falling backward with a crash. "Are you saying my parents were..." "Murdered," Alexander completed, turning to face Jack. "Yes, that's exactly what I believe." Emma rushed to Jack's side, holding him as she saw the color drain from his face. "But why? Who would do such a thing?" Alexander shook his head. "I don't know for certain yet, but I have my suspicions, and I'm afraid Robert Taylor might be involved somehow." The news seemed to reanimate Jack, who straightened up, a fierce determination shining in his eyes. "I need to know everything, Alexander. Every detail, every suspicion. I'm going to get to the bottom of this, whatever it takes." Emma, feeling the tension in Jack's body, hugged him tightly. "You're not alone in this. Jack, I'll be with you every step of the way." Jack looked at her, gratitude and something deeper shining in his eyes. "Thank you, Emma. I don't know what I'd do without you." Alexander observed the exchange with a mixture of approval and concern. "You'll need each other for what's coming. The truth isn't always easy to face, and I'm afraid this is just the tip of the iceberg." As night fell over the Thompson mansion, the three of them immersed themselves in an investigation that promised to unearth long-buried secrets. What they didn't know was that their actions had set in motion a series of events that would shake the foundations of high society and test not only their determination, but also the bonds they were forming. In another part of the city, in a cold and austere cell, Robert Taylor looked out the small barred window, a sinister smile curving his lips. He knew his arrest was only a temporary setback. He had powerful allies, secrets that could destroy lives, and he wasn't willing to fall without dragging others down with him. "Enjoy your little victory," he murmured to himself, "because the game has only just begun." Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The investigation into the death of Jack's parents became increasingly complex, unraveling a web of lies and deceit that extended far beyond what any of them had initially imagined. Emma and Jack spent long hours in the mansion's study, reviewing documents, connecting clues, and trying to make sense of the avalanche of information Alexander provided them. As they worked together, their bond strengthened, transforming into something deeper than mere friendship. One night, as rain gently tapped against the study windows, Jack found himself looking at Emma, who was absorbed in reading an old police report. The dim lamplight bathed her face, highlighting the determination in her eyes and the soft curve of her cheek. In that moment, Jack realized he was falling in love with her. "Emma," he said softly, breaking the silence. She looked up, a small smile forming on her lips. "Yes, Jack?" he began, hesitating for a moment. "I want to thank you for all of this, for being here, for helping me." "You didn't have to do it," Emma put the report aside and moved closer to him, taking his hands in hers. "Jack, you don't have to thank me. I do it because I want to, because I care about you." Their gazes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Jack leaned in slowly, his lips meeting Emma's in a soft, tentative kiss. When they separated, both had flushed cheeks and racing hearts. "I'm sorry," Jack murmured. "I didn't." But Emma silenced him with another kiss, this one more confident and passionate. "Don't apologize," she whispered against his lips. "I've been waiting for this." The blossoming romance between Emma and Jack brought a ray of light into their lives, contrasting with the darkness of the secrets they were uncovering. However, their happiness was about to be tested once again. One morning, as they were having breakfast on the terrace, Alexander arrived with alarming news. "Robert has requested a hearing," he announced, his face grim. "He says he has crucial information about the case and that he'll only share it if Emma and Jack go to see him personally." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "Do we have to go? Couldn't it be a trap?" Jack took her hand, squeezing it gently. "It could be our chance to get answers, Emma. We have to take the risk." Alexander nodded, though concern was evident on his face. "I'll be with you the whole time. I won't let Robert harm you." The visit to the prison was a surreal experience. Robert, despite his situation, maintained an air of arrogance that made Emma shudder. When they entered the visiting room, he greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, the happy couple," he said sarcastically. "How touching." Jack clenched his fists, containing his anger. "You said you had information talk." Robert leaned back in his chair, studying them with a calculating look. "Oh, I have information, lots of it, but before I share it, I want to make a deal." "You're not in a position to negotiate, Robert," Alexander intervened, his voice loaded with contempt. "That's what you think," Robert responded with an enigmatic smile. "But I assure you that what I know could change everything, including your precious inheritance, Jack." Emma felt Jack tense beside her. "What do you mean?" Robert leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. "What if I told you that you're not the only heir to the Carter fortune? What if I told you that you have a brother?" The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Jack staggered, as if he had received a physical blow. Emma held him, looking at Robert with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You're lying," she accused. "Am I?" Robert replied, leaning back again. "Think about it, Emma. Why do you think I went to such lengths to keep Jack hidden all these years? It wasn't just about the money. It was to protect a much bigger secret." Alexander, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "If what you're saying is true, Robert, where is this supposed brother?" Robert's smile widened. "Ah, that's the best part. He's closer than you think. In fact, you've had him right under your noses this whole time." Jack, recovering from the initial shock, approached the table, his eyes fixed on Robert. "Stop playing games and tell us the truth." Robert looked him directly in the eyes. "The truth, my dear Jack, is that your brother is none other than your fiancé." A sepulchral silence fell over the room. Emma felt the world spinning around her, unable to process what she had just heard. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Robert let out a cold laugh. "Is it? Think about it, Emma. Didn't you ever wonder why your mother insisted so much on that clause in her will? Why was she so obsessed with you marrying someone of humble origin?" Alexander stepped forward, his face pale. "Robert, if this is some kind of sick game—" "It's not a game," Robert interrupted. "Sarah Thompson and Mary Carter were sisters, twins to be exact, separated at birth and raised in different families. When they discovered it, it was already too late. They were both married, with established lives, but they made a pact. If anything happened to them, their children would unite, restoring the family bond that was denied to them. Emma collapsed into a chair, feeling like she couldn't breathe. Jack knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his face a mask of confusion and pain. "Emma, look at me," he said softly. "I don't know if what he's saying is true, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." She looked at him, silent tears running down her cheeks. "Jack, if it's true, we're family," he completed, a sad smile curving his lips. "One way or another, we'll always be united." Robert watched the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and contempt. How touching. "But I warn you, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's much more at stake here, and if you want to know the whole truth, you'll have to play by my rules." Alexander, recovering from the initial shock, stepped between Robert and the couple. "You've done enough damage, Robert. This ends here." But as they left the visiting room, they all knew that this was just the beginning. Robert's revelations had opened a Pandora's box, and the consequences of these hidden truths were only beginning to unravel. That night, back at the Thompson mansion, Emma and Jack found themselves in the garden, under the old oak tree that held so many memories. The full moon bathed the place in its silver light, creating shadows that seemed to dance among the leaves. "What are we going to do now?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack looked at her, his eyes shining with a mixture of determination and affection. "We're going to uncover the truth, Emma, together. No matter what happens, I won't let this separate us." As they embraced under the moonlight, they both knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges, but they also knew that, united, they could face any obstacle that fate put in their way. What they didn't know was that, hidden in the shadows of the garden, a figure was watching them, a man whose existence would change the course of their lives once again, a man who held the last and most dangerous secret of all. The days following Robert's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Emma and Jack. The possibility that they were siblings weighed on them like a dark cloud, overshadowing the love they had begun to feel for each other. Alexander Morgan, determined to get to the bottom of the matter, immersed himself in an exhaustive investigation. He spent entire days in dusty archives and endless nights making calls to old contacts. His obsession with uncovering the truth led him to neglect his health, something that didn't go unnoticed by Emma and Jack one afternoon. While reviewing some documents in the mansion study, Alexander collapsed. He fell to the floor, clutching his chest and breathing with difficulty. "Alexander!" Emma cried, running to his side. Jack immediately called for an ambulance while Emma tried to keep Alexander conscious. "I'm sorry," Alexander murmured between gasps. "I should have told you there's something else." But before he could finish the sentence, he lost consciousness. The paramedics arrived minutes later, taking him to the nearest hospital. Emma and Jack spent the night in the waiting room, their hands intertwined, finding comfort in each other's presence despite the uncertainty surrounding their relationship. The next morning, the doctor informed them that Alexander had suffered a mild heart attack, but was stable. When they were finally able to see him, they found him pale and weak, but with a look of determination in his eyes. "Kids," Alexander said as soon as he saw them enter, "I need you to listen carefully. There's something you need to know." Emma sat on the edge of the bed, while Jack remained standing, his hand on her shoulder. "Alexander, you need to rest," Emma began, but he interrupted her with a gesture. "There's no time for that. What I have to tell you is crucial," Jack frowned. "Does it have to do with what Robert told us? About Emma and me being siblings," Alexander completed, letting out a tired sigh. "Yes and no. The truth is much more complicated than you imagine." Alexander then told them a story that left them stunned. He spoke of Sarah Thompson and Mary Carter, twin sisters separated at birth and raised in different families. He told them how, upon discovering the truth about their origin, they had made a pact to unite their families. "But there's more," Alexander continued, his voice growing weaker. "Sarah and Mary weren't the only sisters. There was a third. Emma and Jack exchanged looks of amazement. "A third sister?" "Emma," asked Alexander, nodded. "Her name was Caroline, and she is your real mother, Emma." The revelation fell like a bomb. Emma stood up abruptly, moving away from the bed as if she had received an electric shock. "No, it can't be," she murmured, tears forming in her eyes. "Are you telling me that my whole life has been a lie?" Jack instinctively hugged her, momentarily forgetting the confusion about their own relationship. "Alexander, are you sure about this?" The older man nodded weakly. "Completely." Caroline was the youngest of the three. When she discovered the truth about her sisters, she tried to claim her part of the family inheritance. But Sarah and Mary, fearing a scandal, kept her a secret. "And what happened to her?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. "She disappeared," Alexander replied. "Shortly after giving birth, Sarah, unable to have children of her own, adopted you as hers. They raised you as a Thompson, but always with the fear that the truth would come to light." Jack, processing the information, asked, "But then Emma and I aren't?" "No," Alexander confirmed. "You're not siblings, you're cousins." A heavy silence fell over the room. Emma collapsed into a chair. Overwhelmed by the revelations, Jack knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Emma, look at me," he said softly. "I know this is a lot to process, but it doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change how I feel about you." She looked at him, her eyes full of tears and confusion. "Jack, my whole life, everything I thought I knew about myself, is still true," he completed. "You're the same kind and brave person I fell in love with. None of this changes that." Alexander watched them with a mixture of guilt and relief. "I'm sorry, kids, I should have told you this before, but I feared the truth would hurt you more than you already were." Emma wiped away her tears, trying to process all the information. "Alexander, do you know what happened to Caroline, my real mother?" Alexander's face darkened. "That's the hardest part of this whole story. Caroline didn't disappear of her own will. She was murdered." The revelation struck like lightning in the room. Jack stood up abruptly, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Murdered? By whom?" Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. "By the same man who orchestrated the death of your parents, Jack. The man who has been manipulating our lives from the shadows all these years." "Robert," Emma whispered, the realization hitting her hard. But Alexander shook his head. "No. Emma, Robert is just a pawn in a much bigger game. The real mastermind behind all of this is someone who has been closer than we imagined, someone who has been posing as an ally all this time." Jack frowned, a suspicion forming in his mind. "You're not suggesting that—" "Yes," Alexander confirmed, his voice barely a whisper. "The person responsible for all of this is your father. Jack Andrew Carter is alive." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Jack staggered. As if he had received a physical blow, Emma held him, her own shock momentarily forgotten in the face of Jack's evident pain. "It's impossible," Jack murmured. "I saw my father's body. I was at his funeral." Alexander shook his head. "What you saw was an elaborate staging, Andrew. Faked his death and your mother's to escape the consequences of his actions. He's been pulling the strings from the shadows all this time." Emma, trying to make sense of it all, asked, "But why? Why do all of this?" "For power," Alexander replied, "and for an even darker secret that involves all. 3 families, the Thompsons, the Carters, and the Taylors. A secret that, if it comes to light, could destroy them all." At that moment, a nurse entered the room. Informing them that visiting hours were over, Alexander took Emma's hand, his gaze intense. "You must be careful. Andrew knows we're close to the truth. He'll stop at nothing to keep his secret hidden." As they left the hospital, Emma and Jack felt as if the world had changed beneath their feet. The truth they had been seeking turned out to be much more dangerous and complicated than they had ever imagined. That night, back at the Thompson mansion, Emma and Jack found themselves in the garden, under the old oak tree that had become their refuge. The full moon bathed the place in its silver light, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. "How do you feel?" Emma asked softly, taking Jack's hand in hers. Jack let out a deep sigh. "Honestly, I don't know. It's like my whole life has been a lie. My father, the man I believed dead all these years." His voice broke, unable to continue. Emma hugged him tightly, offering silent comfort. "We'll face it together, Jack. Whatever happens, we're in this together." Jack looked at her, a small smile forming on his lips, despite the pain in his eyes. "Even after knowing we're cousins?" Emma let out a soft laugh. "Especially after knowing we're cousins. At least we're not siblings, right?" The joke managed to lighten the mood for a moment, and they both laughed, finding comfort in each other's presence. But the seriousness of their situation soon fell upon them again. "What do you think that secret is that Alexander was talking about?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack shook his head. "I don't know, but it must be something really big to justify all of this faked deaths, real murders, destroyed families." "Whatever it is," Emma said with determination, "we'll uncover it, and we'll make those responsible pay for what they've done." As they embraced under the moonlight, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from the shadows of the garden. A man whose face, had it been illuminated, would have been painfully familiar to Jack. Andrew Carter watched his son and Emma with a mixture of emotions on his face. Pride, sadness, and an iron determination that spoke of the sacrifices he had made and those he was still willing to make. "I'm sorry, my son," he murmured to himself, "but some truths must remain buried." With that, he vanished into the night, leaving behind only the whisper of leaves moved by the wind. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Emma and Jack, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, immersed themselves in a frantic investigation. They reviewed old family archives, interviewed former employees of the three families, and followed every lead, no matter how small. Meanwhile, Alexander, still recovering in the hospital, provided them with all the information he could. He told them about old rivalries between the families, shady businesses, and secret alliances, but there always seemed to be a missing piece in the puzzle, a crucial detail that eluded them. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents in the mansion study, Emma found something that caught her attention. "Jack, look at this," she said, pointing to an old photograph. "Do you recognize anyone?" Jack approached, studying the image it showed, three young men smiling at the camera. One of them was clearly a younger version of his father, Andrew. Another was Emma's father. But the third, "It can't be," Jack murmured, bringing the photo closer to see it better. "What is it?" Emma asked, intrigued by his reaction. Jack looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "The third man, it's Robert Taylor." The revelation fell like a bomb. How was it possible that Robert, the man who had manipulated their lives, had been friends with their parents in the past? "There's something else," Emma said, pointing to an inscription on the back of the photo. "Look at the date and place." Jack read aloud, "St. Gabriel Mine, 1985. He frowned, trying to remember where he had heard that name before. Suddenly, Emma let out a muffled cry. "The St. Gabriel Mine! Jack, do you remember that old news story we found a few weeks ago? About a mining disaster that was covered up?" Jack nodded, realization hitting him hard. A disaster that occurred in 1985, the same year as this photo. They looked at each other, the same conclusion forming in their minds. Whatever secret united the three families, it had its roots in what had happened in that mine almost 4 decades ago. "We have to go there," Jack said with determination. "To the St. Gabriel Mine. It's the only way to uncover the truth." Emma nodded, though a shadow of concern crossed her face. "But Jack, if we go there, we'll be exposing ourselves. Your father Andrew could be waiting for us." Jack took her hands in his gaze intense. "I know, but we have no other choice. We've come too far to turn back now." As they prepared for their journey, neither of them could shake off the feeling that they were about to open Pandora's box, that the truths they would discover at the St. Gabriel Mine would change their lives forever. What they didn't know was that Andrew Carter was already aware of their plans, and that the trip to the mine would be just the beginning of a series of events that would test not only their love, but their very survival. As Emma and Jack packed for their trip to the St. Gabriel mine, a shadowy figure watched them from a distance. Andrew Carter, hidden among the trees surrounding the Thompson mansion, felt a mixture of pride and fear as he saw the determination on his son's face. "They're smarter than I thought," he murmured to himself, a sad smile curving his lips. "So much like their mothers." With a sigh, he took out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Robert," he said, as soon as the call was answered. "It's time, they're on their way to the mine. Prepare everything." On the other end of the line, Robert Taylor, recently released on bail thanks to his connections, smiled maliciously. "Understood, old friend." "What about?" "Alexander?" Andrew frowned. "Take care of him, he can't interfere anymore." With that, he hung up the call and turned his attention back to the mansion. He saw Emma and Jack come out, suitcases in hand, heading towards an uncertain future. For a moment, Andrew felt the urge to come out of hiding, to hug his son and confess everything, but the weight of the secrets he kept was too great. "I'm sorry, my son," he whispered as he watched them leave. But some truths are too dangerous to be revealed. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Alexander Morgan was fighting between life and death. The doctors couldn't explain the sudden deterioration of his health. What they didn't know was that Robert Taylor had managed to infiltrate someone into the hospital staff, someone who was slowly administering an undetectable poison to Alexander. In his moments of lucidity, Alexander struggled to communicate, to warn Emma and Jack of the danger they were in. But every time he tried to speak, his voice faded away and darkness claimed him. The journey to the St. Gabriel mine was long and tense. Emma and Jack spent most of the time in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts and fears. As they approached their destination, the landscape became more rugged and desolate. Finally, after hours of travel, they arrived at what remained of the St. Gabriel mine. The place seemed abandoned for decades, with rusty structures and ruined buildings that stood like skeletons against the grey sky. "This is it," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. "Where it all began." Emma took his hand, squeezing it gently. "We're in this together, Jack, whatever happens." As they entered the mining complex, a sense of unease came over them. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their steps on debris and the occasional caw of a crow. Suddenly, Jack stopped short. "Emma, look," he said, pointing towards a half-collapsed structure. There, barely visible under years of rust and abandonment, was a symbol that Emma immediately recognized from old family documents. "The emblem of the three families," she murmured, her heart racing. "Thompson, Carter, and Taylor. They were in this together." Jack nodded, his face grim. "The question is, in what exactly?" Before Emma could respond, a noise startled them. The sound of footsteps approaching. By instinct, they hid behind some debris, their hearts pounding. The footsteps came closer and closer, until finally they could see who they belonged to. Emma had to contain a cry of surprise. There, a few meters from them, was Andrew Carter, Jack's father. The man who was supposed to have been dead for 2 decades was walking through the ruins of the mine as if he knew every corner. Jack tensed beside her, and Emma could see the conflict in his eyes. The desire to run to his father, to demand answers, fought against caution and fear of the unknown. Before they could decide what to do, Andrew's voice broke the silence. "I know you're there," he said, his voice loaded with contained emotions. "Come out. It's time you knew the truth." Emma and Jack exchanged a look. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment they feared and longed for in equal parts. With a silent nod, they came out of hiding, finally facing the man who had been at the center of all the mystery. Andrew looked at them, a mixture of pride and sadness in his eyes. "You've come a long way," he said, "further than I ever imagined you would." Jack stepped forward, his body trembling with contained emotion. "Dad," he began, his voice breaking. "Why?" Andrew raised a hand, stopping his son's questions. "I know you have 1,000 questions and I promise I'll answer them all, but first you need to see something." With that, he turned and began walking towards one of the larger structures in the mining complex. Emma and Jack, after exchanging a look of uncertainty, followed him. Andrew led them through rusty corridors and rooms filled with abandoned machinery. Finally, they stopped in front of a wall that seemed solid. Andrew pressed a sequence of bricks, and to Emma and Jack's surprise, the wall slid to one side, revealing a secret passage. "Welcome," Andrew said, his voice grave, "to the true heart of the St. Gabriel mine." The passage led them to an underground room, illuminated by fluorescent lights that flickered weakly. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and ancient documents. In the center of the room was a long table, on which rested an object covered by a cloth. Andrew approached the table and, with a dramatic gesture, removed the cloth. Emma and Jack gasped in unison. On the table was a stone the size of a fist, emitting a soft bluish glow. Its facets seemed to change and move, as if it had a life of its own. "This," Andrew said, his voice loaded with reverence, "is the reason for everything. The curse and blessing of our families." Emma moved closer, fascinated by the stone. "What is it?" "The local miners called it the heart of the mountain," Andrew replied. "We simply know it as the stone." Jack, who had been observing in silence, finally spoke. "What does this have to do with the deaths, the lies, all this conspiracy?" Andrew sighed deeply, the weight of decades of secrets visible on his shoulders. "Everything, my son, everything." And so Andrew began to relate a story that dated back to 1985, when three ambitious young men, Andrew Carter, William Thompson, and Robert Taylor, discovered the stone during an exploration in the mine. "At first we didn't understand its power," Andrew explained, "but soon we discovered that the stone could change things, alter reality itself." Emma and Jack listened, stunned, as Andrew told them how the three friends had used the power of the stone to quickly rise in their respective fields. Fortunes made overnight, rivals who mysteriously disappeared, political decisions that inexplicably favored them. "But power has a price," Andrew continued, his voice breaking. "The stone began to claim lives first, mine workers, then close relatives and friends." Jack felt his blood run cold. "Mom," he whispered. Andrew nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "Your mother, William's wife, Carolyn, all victims of the stone's insatiable power." Emma, processing all this information, asked, "Is that why you faked your death? To protect Jack?" "Yes," Andrew replied. "I hoped that by distancing myself I could break the connection between the stone and Jack. But I was wrong. Fate has a cruel way of reuniting those marked by the stone." Suddenly, a noise at the room's entrance startled them. Robert Taylor entered, followed by a group of armed men. "What a touching family reunion," Robert said with a cold smile. "Too bad I have to interrupt it." Andrew stepped between Robert and the young couple. "Robert, don't do this. We've caused enough damage." Robert let out a bitter laugh. "Damage? We're just getting started, old friend with the stone. We can rewrite history. We can have the world at our feet. Jack," seeing the madness in Robert's eyes, understood the magnitude of the danger they faced. "You can't control its power, Robert. No one can." "That remains to be seen," Robert replied, signaling his men, "Take the stone." What followed was chaos. Andrew lunged at Robert, while Emma and Jack fought against the armed men. In the midst of the confusion, the stone fell to the floor, its glow intensifying. Suddenly, a tremor shook the room. Cracks began to form in the walls and ceiling, and the floor beneath their feet shuddered. "The mine is collapsing," Emma shouted. Andrew, seeing the imminent danger, made a decision. With a quick movement, he grabbed the stone. "Run!" he shouted to Emma and Jack. "Get out of here!" Jack tried to reach his father, but Emma held him back. "Jack, we have to go." With a heavy heart, Jack allowed Emma to drag him towards the exit as they ran. Through the collapsing corridors of the mine, they heard a deafening roar behind them. They managed to get out just as the mine entrance collapsed, sealing the fate of those who remained inside, panting and covered in dust. Emma and Jack embraced, watching as the St. Gabriel mine became a tomb of secrets and ambitions. "It's over," Emma whispered, tears running down her cheeks. Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the ruins. Yes, it's over. But at what cost? As the sun began to set on the horizon, Emma and Jack remained silent, aware that their lives would never be the same again. The truth they had sought so desperately turned out to be more painful and complicated than they had ever imagined. But in the midst of tragedy and loss, they had each other, and that they decided would have to be enough to face whatever the future held for them. What they didn't know was that, under the rubble of the mine, the stone continued to glow, its power intact, patiently waiting for someone else to discover its secrets, because some stories, like some powers, never really end. They just wait for the right moment to resurface. 6 months had passed since the tragic events at the St. Gabriel mine. Emma and Jack had returned to the city, trying to rebuild their lives and process everything they had discovered. The disappearance of Andrew Carter and Robert Taylor had been national news for weeks, but gradually the media interest had faded, leaving behind only unanswered questions and conspiracy theories. On a spring morning, Emma was in the garden of the Thompson mansion, tending to the roses that her adoptive mother, Sarah, had loved so much. The sun shone softly, and a cool breeze carried the scent of freshly opened flowers. It was a beautiful day, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Jack found her there, lost in her thoughts. He approached quietly and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "A penny for your thoughts," he murmured in her ear. Emma leaned back against him, finding comfort in his presence. "I was thinking about everything that's happened, how our lives changed in such a short time." Jack nodded, understanding perfectly. He himself had spent countless sleepless nights going over the events at the mine, wondering if he could have done something different, if he could have saved his father. "I know," he said softly. "Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever know the whole truth." Emma turned to look at him, her eyes full of determination. "Maybe we don't need to know everything. Maybe what's important is what we do with what we do know." Jack smiled, once again admiring the strength and wisdom of the woman he loved. "You're right. And speaking of that," he paused as if gathering courage, "I've been thinking about something." Emma looked at him curiously. "What about?" Jack took her hands in his. "About using the Carter fortune for something good, creating a foundation that helps people who need it most. I think it's what our parents would have wanted." Emma's eyes lit up with excitement. "Jack, that's wonderful, and I think I know exactly where we can start." That afternoon, Emma and Jack visited the hospital where Alexander Morgan was still recovering. Although he had survived the poisoning, his health was still delicate. When they entered his room, they found him sitting by the window, his gaze lost on the horizon. "Alexander," Emma called softly. The older man turned, a tired smile lighting up his face when he saw them. "My dear children, how good to see you." Jack approached, placing a hand on Alexander's shoulder. "We have news, Alexander, good news." They told him about their plan to create a foundation, to use the resources of the Carter and Thompson families to make a positive difference in the world. Alexander listened attentively, his eyes shining with pride and emotion. "You're doing the right thing," he finally said. "You're breaking the cycle of secrets and ambition that consumed our families for generations." Emma took Alexander's hand in hers. "And we want you to be part of this, Alexander. Your wisdom and experience will be invaluable." Alexander felt tears forming in his eyes. For the first time in decades, he felt there was hope, that the mistakes of the past could be redeemed. "It will be an honor," he replied, his voice loaded with emotion. The following months were a whirlwind of activity. Emma and Jack worked tirelessly to establish the New Dawn Foundation. They used their connections and resources to help marginalized communities, fund educational programs, and support environmental causes. As the foundation grew and gained recognition, Emma and Jack realized they were building something bigger than themselves. They were creating a legacy of kindness and compassion, one they hoped would endure long after they were gone. One afternoon, while overseeing the construction of a new school in an underprivileged neighborhood, Jack surprised Emma with a question. "Will you marry me?" Emma looked at him, surprised by the sudden proposal. "Jack, are you sure?" He nodded, taking her hands in his. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Emma, and I want to spend the rest of my life building this dream with you." With tears of happiness in her eyes, Emma responded, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Their wedding, celebrated in the gardens of the Thompson mansion, was an event full of joy and hope. Friends, family, and beneficiaries of the foundation gathered to celebrate not only the union of two people, but the birth of a new era for their families. Alexander, still weak but determined to be present, watched them with fatherly pride. When the time came for speeches, he stood up with the help of his cane and asked for the floor. "Not long ago," he began, his voice loaded with emotion, "I believed our families were doomed by the mistakes of the past, but Emma and Jack have shown me that there is always hope, that it's always possible to choose a different path." He paused, looking at the happy couple. "You have taken the legacy of your families and transformed it into something beautiful and noble. You have shown that true power doesn't come from wealth or influence, but from kindness and compassion." He raised his glass in a toast to Emma and Jack and to the bright future they're building, not just for themselves, but for all of us. As the guests applauded and the celebration continued, Emma and Jack shared a look full of love and promises. They knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, that there would be challenges and obstacles to overcome. But they also knew that, together, they could face anything. That night, under a starry sky, they danced their first dance as husband and wife. And as they twirled to the rhythm of the music, they both felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. They had found their purpose, their path in life, and best of all, they had found it together. Years later, the New Dawn Foundation had become a beacon of hope for thousands of people across the country. Emma and Jack had managed not only to keep their family's legacy alive, but to transform it into something truly noble and meaningful. One autumn afternoon, as Emma was overseeing the inauguration of a new community center on the outskirts of the city, she received an urgent call from Jack. "Emma, you need to come to the hospital right now." Jack's voice sounded tense, a mixture of emotion and concern. "It's Alexander." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Alexander, who had become a father figure to both of them, had been fighting a terminal illness for the past few months. Without losing a second, Emma headed to the hospital. When she arrived at Alexander's room, she found Jack holding the old man's hand. Alexander looked more fragile than ever, but there was a light in his eyes that Emma hadn't seen in a long time. "My dear children," Alexander said in a weak but affectionate voice, "I have something important to tell you." Emma sat on the other side of the bed, taking Alexander's other hand. "We're here, Alexander, we're listening." Alexander coughed slightly before continuing, "I've kept one last secret all these years, one that I thought was better kept hidden. But now, at the end of my life, I realize that you deserve to know the truth." Jack and Emma exchanged a worried look. What else could there be after everything they had discovered? "The stone," Alexander whispered. "It wasn't destroyed in the mine collapse." Emma felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean?" Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. "Your father, Jack Andrew. He managed to get it out of the mine before the collapse. He entrusted it to me to keep it safe." Jack stood up abruptly, his face a mask of shock and confusion. "Is my father alive?" Alexander sadly shook his head. "No. Jack Andrew sacrificed his life to ensure the stone didn't fall into the wrong hands. But before he died, he made me promise to protect it until the right time came." "And that time is now?" Emma asked, her mind spinning with the implications of this revelation. Alexander nodded weakly. "You two have shown a wisdom and compassion that goes beyond your years. You've used your influence and resources for the common good. Without succumbing to the temptation of power, I believe you're ready for the responsibility that the stone carries." With trembling hands, Alexander took out a small chest from under his pillow. When he opened it, the familiar bluish glow of the stone illuminated the room. Emma and Jack looked at the object with a mixture of awe and fear. They knew the power it contained, the potential for good and evil that resided in its shining facets. "What are we supposed to do with it?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. Alexander smiled weakly. That, my dear boy, is the question you'll have to answer. Yourselves. The stone is an instrument, neither good nor evil in itself. Its power depends on the intentions of those who possess it. Emma took Jack's hand, seeking and offering comfort at the same time. We'll figure it out together, she said with determination. We'll use its power for good to continue and expand the work of the foundation. Jack nodded, squeezing Emma's hand. We'll make our parents proud, make you proud. Alexander. Alexander looked at them with eyes full of love and pride. I already am, my children, I already am. With those words, Alexander closed, his eyes for the last time, a serene smile on his face. He had fulfilled his last mission, passing the legacy to the next generation. In the days and weeks that followed, Emma and Jack faced the challenge of integrating the stone into their lives and the work of the foundation. They discovered that its power, when used with wisdom and compassion, could achieve miracles, curing diseases thought incurable, reversing environmental damage even, influencing the hearts and minds of the powerful to make more ethical and compassionate decisions. But with each use of the stone, they also felt the weight of responsibility. They knew that a single misstep, a moment of weakness or selfishness, could trigger catastrophic consequences. One night, as they watched the sunset from the balcony of their home, Jack embraced Emma from behind, his hand resting gently on her belly, where the new life they had created together was growing. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Jack asked, his voice loaded with emotion. Do you think our child will inherit this responsibility? Emma turned in his arms, looking into his eyes. I think we're doing the best we can with the power we've been entrusted with, and I think our child, like us, will have the choice to choose their own path. Jack nodded, a smile forming on his lips. You're right, we can't control the future, but we can shape the present with our actions and decisions. As the sun sank into the horizon, bathing the city in golden and pink hues, Emma and Jack remained silent, contemplating the future they were building. A future full of hope, love, and infinite possibilities. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges, temptations, and moments of doubt. But they also knew that together they could overcome any obstacle, because their love, forged in the fire of adversity and tempered by compassion and wisdom, was stronger than any magical power. It was the true force that shaped their destiny, and that of all those whose lives they touched. And so, as night fell gently over the city, Emma and Jack prepared for the next chapter of their life together. A chapter full of promises, challenges, and the exciting uncertainty of tomorrow. For in the great book of destiny, their story was just a beginning. A beginning full of love, hope, and the promise of a bright future for all those whose lives had been touched by the power of the stone, and more importantly by the power of true love.